Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. My guest today is Erik Larsen, one of the co-founders of Image Comics. Erik, welcome to Comic Culture.
Thanks for having me.
As one of the seven who started Image Comics, you've kind of had to wear many different hats as both an artist and an executive. So how do you handle telling a story every 30 days and getting that book out on time and taking care of all that unpleasant business stuff?
I pawn off as much of the unpleasant business stuff on others as humanly possible. Concentrate on getting my work done. It's actually the business end of things doesn't take up a huge part of my existence. So mostly I concentrate on getting the comic book stuff done, and when other stuff needs to be accomplished, I'll do that as quickly and efficiently as possible. Also, after a certain amount of time, you do kind of develop ways of doing things and routines that make life a little bit easier.
And this is 25 years since you broke off from Marvel, and I guess about 25 years since you've been doing Savage Dragon every month. So how do you come up with an idea that's going to be fresh for you as a creator, and how does the character evolve so that you can keep telling stories through him?
What I did early on is I set the book in real time so that characters age as we age. Because of that, it forces change on me, which makes it so that it's constantly fresh in some way. Characters are getting older. They're going through the life changes that people go through as they get older. Dragon had a son. He was born in issue 33. That son is now the lead character of the book. And he'll be 21 in October, and he's married himself and has children of his own. So it becomes this generational thing, and they're just constantly tossing in different things which affect the status quo and make things change from month to month, and that keeps it fresh.
And I would imagine, too, because you're setting it in real time and having the calendar pass as it does for us, that gives you a chance to pull the real world into what you do a little bit. So maybe it's a song, or one of your recent issues featured, I guess, sort of an interpretation of a hate monger sort of story.
Well, you can do a lot of different sorts of things. You can tie it into very specific dates, and there gets to be advantages and disadvantages to doing things that way. Some of the subplot stuff that we're routinely used to seeing in comics, where somebody gets on a bus and then we see them on the bus in subsequent issues leading up to something that pays off a few issues down the road. It's like, well, are they riding that bus for 3 months, for crying out loud? Pick a direction. So some of that stuff kind of doesn't work out as well as you'd like it to. It does mean being fairly succinct in a lot of different things, so that it can make some sense and then there ends up being times where I simply have to play catch up, where I've done issues that feed directly into other issues, and then suddenly I go, I'm 6 months behind where I need to be. So there'll be a passage of time written into the comic in some way.
Well, I guess that way you could have the cliffhanger, is the fight going to go one way or is it going to go the other? And then you can just kind of catch up later on as you go.
Yeah, they'll end up often in the middle of his story. There'll be something where there'll just be a passage of time worked into the narrative that and it generally makes a certain amount of sense. Like if in the issue that I'm doing right now, the characters end up moving from one place to another, and there's a lot of logistics that come along with moving from one place to another in terms of packing and unpacking and finding apartments and all that sort of stuff. That can be covered in fairly rapid succession, but at the same time, you can go, hey, 4 months passed during this issue, and it doesn't come off as weird or terrible, whatever. It's like doing TV shows where they would have like a whole case that would involve lawyers and stuff like that. And you could realize, well, in reality, this whole thing from beginning to actual trial is several years, but we can't cover several years over the course of a week because wouldn't actually happen during that week period. So you just kind of have to pick and choose what to cover and what not to cover, stuff like that.
And as a writer, how do you feel that you've a lot of people say that as they do things longer and longer, and you mentioned this before, you kind of get that shorthand for doing things. So as a writer, how have you, I guess, sort of refined your craft so that you know these characters in and out, and you can keep popping in, the conflict of the month, so to speak, and hit that deadline and have it still be interesting to you?
Jeez, I have no idea. I'm just making this stuff up as I go along, mister. It's such an organic way of working. I can't even begin to articulate in some ways how I'm able to make this stuff work. As time goes on, I've just kind of eliminated some of the little steps, and it's like I used to do tiny thumbnails, then blow things up and trace things off. I used to do much more involved plotting or scripting and stuff like that early on. Now I am plotting essentially as I draw it, and there's no written anything.
So it could go anywhere.
A lot of everybody. It's like, wait a minute, how did you do that? That doesn't even make sense. But that's part of my process of doing this stuff, is coming into it with kind of, there's a vague idea of where I'm going with it, but it's not nailed down into the specifics of, well, this is going to happen on this particular page. I just kind of go into it with a general understanding of, I need to get from A to B. Let's get that done.
And so you don't find that you've painted yourself into a corner and then have to quickly erase?
Generally not. I'm pretty good at getting out of corners too. As time goes on, I just kind of go, all right, and often it'll seem like, wow, you really thought that through. And it's like,
Now, over the 25 years, your art style has evolved and refined, and you've got a very energetic style. And I'm just wondering, I can see a Kirby influence in what you do. And I'm just wondering if that's something that you aspire to, or is it just that, again, that organic evolution of, sitting at the drawing table day after day and putting those characters on the board?
It just evolves. There's just no stopping it, really. And you just try and do the best you can in the time you have to do it in. But I'm not sitting here going, I'm going this one place, and I want to get to this one place. You just kind of just start drawing, and what comes out of the pencil, what comes out of the pen, ends up being what you got. That's what you have. So if it's heading in one direction or another, you just try and find what makes it interesting and do the best you can with the tools you have at your disposal.
And you're using the traditional pencil, paper, or pencil Bristol board and ink, as opposed to, let's say, the computer stuff. Is there a reason why?
Well, I like it. I like the tactile thing. I'm making stuff up. I'm not using somebody else's SketchUp models and moving pre-existing buildings around and finding new directions. I'm sitting there actually drawing. And I like having physical artwork just as a thing, as a curiosity, if nothing else, that it's neat to have, for people can own a piece of what I do, put that on their wall or whatever, That, and also, selling original artwork does end up being another source of income that you don't have when you're creating stuff digitally. Now, there are things that I will do to manipulate things digitally somewhat, because there's the things that you used to use Zipatone, for example, and cut out that stuff, cut out dot patterns and adhere things to paper and stuff like that. And that's not as readily available as it used to be. And it's just as easily done in Photoshop, and it looks the same in print. So might as well use those shortcuts. And so the original art then ends up looking somewhat different from the printed page, but that's all part of the fun too. So.
Well, part of the fun too, I guess, would have to be the storytelling, the coming up with a new way to tell the same type of story. So I'm wondering what your philosophy, I guess, would be in telling a story.
Well, the thing that and often I'll have the same discussion with various artists or various other creators who want to produce comics, is that unlike any other medium, when you open up a comic book, you are seeing 2 pages at once that are spread out before you. So if your eye is caught on the red skull on the right-hand page, you've essentially spoiled it for yourself. That doesn't happen in books. That doesn't happen in movies. In a comic book, though, you're seeing ahead of time. So basically what I tell people is think of your final panel on a right-hand page as your cliffhanger and the panel 1 on the left-hand page as your surprise. And pace your stories accordingly. You're building to the page turn rather than the commercial break, as you would on a TV show. And that's part of it, is realizing, look, there's this process you go through. In every kind of medium that you're working in, there ends up being these kinds of parameters that you need to work within, and it's like, hey, in comics, we don't have real movement. So you can't describe to somebody, he shakes his head. It's like, okay, that's impossible to draw, and you'd get scripts from people where they would describe things which are physically impossible to draw. He crawls through the desert, the full moon behind him, sweat on his brow, towards a temple. It's like, well, if I'm showing the temple, I'm not showing the moon. If I'm showing the moon, I'm not showing the temple. If I'm showing that he's got sweat on his face, we can't see the temple. There ends up being all these things that come into play, mostly because the writer wasn't thinking, oh yeah, this has to be one drawing. I've asked this to be a splash page, and it doesn't make any sense.
Right, and it's interesting because I know that when I dabble in cartooning in my spare time, which seems to be once every 6 years, but trying to lead the eye a certain way, like you were talking about on the page, it seems that every page has a beginning and an end that really needs to grab the reader. So just out of curiosity, if I'm designing a page, and let's say I have this really cool idea, and I saw this once in an issue of Blue Beetle. I forget who the penciler was, but he had this sort of a Steranko-esque kind of bit where the Blue Beetle is spiraling down the right-hand side of the page. But on the left-hand side of the page, there were other elements of the story, and I found it kind of hard to read. So when you see something like that, how could one solve a problem? I know it's not your problem to solve, but what should I be thinking as an artist if I come up with that great visual? How can I tighten it up and make it work?
It depends on the kind of problem that you're being faced with. I tend to want to make panel arrangements as idiot-proof as possible, but even that can be aided by careful placement of word balloons, where you can actually stack word balloons in such a way that you could lead the reader down a left-handed stack on a page, and so that the right hand could be a taller element. Without that, the reader's eye can be left to wander and not know exactly where you're supposed to be. Generally, try to lead the action towards the next panel if at all possible, or at least left to right if that's the way you're orienting your storytelling.
And well, it's a great answer. I mean, you do see a lot of art now that is very beautifully rendered, but might not have the strength of storytelling behind it. Maybe they kind of keep the camera in the same position, so we're always looking at the characters the same way.
Yeah, there's so much to it. It's hard to simply say, well, do it this way and it's going to be awesome, because there is no this way it's going to be awesome. Um, Generally, I try to think in terms of depth of a panel, so that there's a foreground, there's middle ground, and background kind of elements, so that things don't seem super flat. You try to mix things up so that you've got some panels where there are close-ups on things, and some panels where you're really setting a scene, and so you're farther away. And that's going to make it so your pages don't seem so dull and monotonous. Do have both left and right-hand pages sitting next to one another when you're working on them, so that you're not sitting there going, look, I drew this same kind of face from the same kind of angle on the left-hand page and on the right-hand page. I really didn't mean to have those two faces look so much the same as each other on budding pages. Just have an awareness of, look, these panels are going to be this way on one side, these panels are going to be this other way on this other side. I don't want to have an unintentional double page spread where I've decided I'm going to bleed this out to all edges, and then the next page I'm going to bleed this out to all edges, and then have panel elements that are lining up and leading the reader's eye across the two pages when I want them to be read separately. Generally try to go, okay, well, if I'm bleeding something on a left-hand page, then on a right-hand page, everything's got to be contained within boxes, so that it's crystal clear where you're supposed to be going and where your eyes are supposed to be heading this.
Now, I've spoken to some other artists who've talked about how they would use black to sort of guide the eye a certain way. They would spot the blacks in certain spots to kind of lead the eye a certain way across a panel, across a page. And I'm wondering if in the era of computer coloring, if that is the really strong black element on the page is still something that artists are going for, or do they say, well, we can do that in coloring and we don't have to get, that messy?
It's hit and miss. The thing is that colorists can also change black line art to something else. So suddenly this background that you thought, oh, it's going to be this deep black, is suddenly, no, it's a dark green. And there are other things that are suddenly have lens flares and highlights that you didn't intend to be there. But yeah, I think generally artists are just kind of going, look, I'm going to do the best I can, and I hope to hell the rest of the people play along. Because you can't control that unless you do control that. If you're like me, I'm dealing directly with my colorist, and so I'll say, don't color hold this, or don't do that, or make sure that these colors from one page to another are colored in a very different way, so that you're not seeing them as the same scene. Often I'll go, color this page in blues, color this page in oranges, that sort of thing, so that it's like, oh, we've definitely gone from one place to another, and that scene change is crystal clear.
And another question I have is, a lot of comics today, the individual issue isn't as important to some of the companies because they know that they're going to package 6 issues together in a trade. And then that also leads to, if you have a double-page spread, you have to sort of plan out how that's going to be, not just in the issue, but in the trade. And I'm wondering if that's something that you had to think about in your, coming up with a book.
Well, at Image and at what I'm doing, I know what's going to be a left-hand page and I know it's going to be a right-hand page always. We don't intersperse ads unless we want to intersperse ads. So none of those are real questions that I'm sitting there going, oh, I don't know what's going on here. I know exactly what's going on and I can place everything precisely so that it does work. I try to make every individual issue a complete statement so that if you're reading an individual chapter, you don't have it end in the same place where it began and feel like, well, I could have missed this issue entirely and I'd be just fine. You try to have it be that it's a satisfying read in and of itself. And I try and help that along by having the other elements that are also in the book. So there are letters pages, there are funnies, there are bio pages, there's extra content that's in those individual issues, which make those individual issues something that one might actually want as an individual issue, and then when it's collected as a trade, there may be other stuff in there as well, but there's also stuff that's not there. The letters pages aren't there, the bio pages aren't there, there isn't this other stuff that's suddenly missing from the equation.
You mentioned a letters page, and that's something that used to be in just about every Marvel or DC comic. You'd be able to read the letters from the readers. And I'm just wondering, in the era of social media, how interactive are you with your readers? I'm
fairly interactive with readers in social media, but at the same time, I do want there to be letters in the comic book itself because I like that as kind of a time capsule that goes on. You can talk to people on Twitter, you can respond on Facebook, but all of that stuff kind of rotates out of view and is essentially lost forever at some point, whereas the letters page in a comic book is permanently a part of that comic book. And you can look back 20 years ago and go, well, what were people reading about and what were people thinking about these events at that point, and it's still there. Whereas if you're trying to find a message on a message board from 20 years ago, that can be considerably more difficult.
Now, before we started the program today, you had pulled some pages, and I was wondering if you would be able to show us just some of the work that you do and maybe talk us through what you do with those pages.
This is completely random because I was just I've started working twice up. So, and it's twice up with a bleed. So this is a page that was from a recent issue, whereas this is a page from some time ago.
So
this is the old kind of the middle of the standard that goes on now is pretty much this size, and even this is a little smaller than what comics were done for years and years. It used to be 10 by 15 was the standard interior box. I think this is a little more than 9 inches. But then what had happened in comics for years were drawn twice up. They were drawn this big, and it was just a way that you could fit in more detail and you can have your work be a little rougher to some degree because it was going to shrink down that much more and everything was going to tighten up. And it was just something where I tried it once and I was like, all right, this is pretty fun, so I'm going to continue to do this some more. What old comics didn't have, though, was a bleed. comics now, the artwork can extend to the edge of the printed page. So if you notice, there's a line around this,
Hmm.
which indicates how much further it can go. And in some cases, what I'll do is I'll have drawings that do extend all the way to the outside like that.
That is, first off, that is, it's stunning to see the level of detail that you're putting into a page, and also that you're working on the double the size. That's when you go to the shows, you see the old Golden Age work, and it's
Yeah,
that large.
yeah,
Um,
it's cool. And the thing is, too, is I would do double page spreads would be literally twice this big. And so, I mean, scanning is a pain in the butt, but you're sitting there working on something that's the size of a car door, and it's just like it's cool because you can do stuff that you is much more difficult to do on a smaller scale.
uh,
And drawings have this real sense of scope when you're working that much bigger. But yeah, it's more time consuming. So
it's simply amazing because you're working on what appears to be a city being destroyed, and it has that epic scope that we would see in a classic New Gods or a Fantastic Four. And I'm just dumbfounded that this is something that you're able to do, 22, 23 times a month and get a book out.
yeah, well, just step it up, man. It's no time for goofing off. Um,
And you also make appearances at cons where you get to meet with your fans. Do you do commissions while you're there as well?
I do I do commissions at conventions, but only there. I don't do them from home. I don't mail stuff to people. So when I'm at home, it's like I got to be working on the comics and I got to be getting that part done. And I've had some tough times where I'll end up going to two or three conventions in fairly rapid succession, and then sitting there going, "Uh-oh, I'm in real trouble. I can't get this out in time." And there's been various periods over the 25 years where I had other commitments, and was the image publisher for a number of years, and production had slowed to a crawl when I was doing that.
Well,
So, eventually I stepped away from that job and got back to doing this creative stuff full time, and well, life is much better.
well, Erik, I'm sorry to say, but we've run out of time here today. I'd like to thank you so much for being the guest on Comic Culture, and you at home for watching. We'll see you again soon.